Absolutely. Hey, y'all.
And just earlier today, I saw a video of Cuban President Miguel Diaz-Canel talking about really trying to encourage the Cuban people to come out into the streets tomorrow for Palestine. Uh, he said in part, quote, "We march for peace alongside the people who struggle to make a better world possible." Now, this is noteworthy, I think, for a number of reasons. I mean, number one, as I'm sure some of us know, there's a long running relationship and solidarity between Cuba and Palestine, two places whose history has, been racked by not only colonialism and things like this, but to this very day, the fact that imperialism has really just savaged these countries, the peoples, their land and resources and things like that, and all for no other reason than to buttress the largest and most sophisticated empire that the world has ever seen. I also think it's noteworthy to see a world leader, a leader of a sovereign country, take his time to record this video, wear a keffiyeh, excuse me, and basically very openly talk about his support for Palestine. And see, for me, I think that's an indication of how vibrant and how much vitality the movement for the liberation of Palestine is right now. And again, not just in the US, but all over the world. I mean, the world, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that the world has really shown up for Palestine since October 7th.
Absolutely.
We've seen it. We've seen protests, demonstrations, different social movements and organizations on every continent standing with Palestine. We see different governments at different levels criticizing the US and Israel for the genocide in Palestine and calling for a ceasefire. The United States and Israel's position, in my opinion, is really not tenable at this point. It's certainly not popular. Now, what will happen from here, I think, of course, remains to be seen. I think when we look at the fact that Israel is threatening this invasion of Rafah, I believe they have set an actual date to do that, which I believe will be a few days after tomorrow. Actually, it'll be March 10th. March 10th is the sort of announced day of this invasion. So a little over a week. And you're talking about a place where, 1.5 million Palestinians were displaced there. They were driven into Rafah, sort of further tightening, the already sort of tiny open air prison sort of reality. And so now basically these people are trapped and facing an invasion from an Israeli military, of course, buttressed and supported by the US and other nations. And in doing so, I think has really shown the hand of Israel in the US in a number of ways. I think that Zionism and the apartheid state of Israel knows that it's in decline. And it knows that not only is it becoming increasingly unpopular, but its very existence comes under threat, not only because of the brave and valiant resistance of the Palestinian people and the different resistance groups, but also because of the strength of the solidarity that has been seen all around the world. And so in the same way that Zionism feels itself under threat, imperialism feels itself under threat.
Right.
And how is imperialism responding to this? You know, obviously implicated through its support of Israel. It's not engaging in, you know, real or honest diplomacy or anything like that. It never really did. I mean, you know, if you read through books like, you know, The 100 Years War on Palestine by Rashid Khalidi, he talks about these different accords and, you know, meetings and things that were supposedly supposed to work toward peace. But in reality, these were just public relations moves meant to provide cover for Israel's genocidal violence, right? And so since the US and Israel are not interested in real diplomacy, as we've seen, I mean, Netanyahu has rejected you know, any agreement that necessitates a ceasefire. And we've seen Joe Biden flatly you know, say that there will not be a ceasefire. Although I should point out, I think that, you know, Biden has been somewhat critical of Netanyahu in a very token, superficial way. It's obviously not genuine. He's just trying to salvage his election chances. And maybe that'll work, maybe it won't. I don't know. As far as that. But the point I'm getting to is that since imperialism and apartheid Israel, which is supported by imperialism, since they feel like they've been pushed in a corner, they're resulting to the only things they know. And that's war. That's massacres. It's violence, bloodshed, destruction. I don't know when was the last time that our listeners were able to just have a look at a photo of Gaza. It barely looks real. I mean, it seems like there's barely anything that is really left. I mean, there are structures that are still standing, but they're just sort of hollowed out shells of what they once were, and just rubble everywhere. Rubble that still has people under it, mind you.
Right.
And so even though imperialism and Zionism are using violence to try to maintain their power, in reality, this is the very thing that's undermining their power, because it shows the reality of both what imperialism's interests are and what Zionism's interests really are. And that is this genocide and this ongoing ethnic cleansing. And Washington is more than willing to use our tax dollars, to steal our tax dollars, to carry out this bloodshed, because Israel is a crucial aspect of how U.S. maintains hegemony in what we call the Middle East. And, you know, we've also seen situations like Aaron Bushnell, a veteran who self-immolated, set himself on fire in protest of this genocide. And you know what happened when that man set himself on fire? The police pulled guns on him.
Right.
They pulled guns on him like he was a threat. You see what I mean? And so this is all of these things that we've been sort of saying. And certainly I wouldn't recommend someone to self-immolate, but this is a tactic that we've seen happen in different parts of history with the Vietnam War and all of these sorts of things. Like Bushnell himself said, is an extreme form of protest. But I think for the rest of us, we would do well to maintain this mass movement that we've been developing, and to continue to build and to continue to strengthen it, as it's clearly still needed. You know, it's important that we're here for the movement. So we salute Aaron Bushnell, and we're clear that the movement itself has to grow and strengthen if these things are to be really addressed, and if Palestine is to really be free. I believe we've got our guests on
We
for
do. We
awesome. And so,
absolutely do.
yeah, and I hope you all will join me in welcoming Bryce Green, a contributor to Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, also known as FAIR, which you can check out at fair.org. Bryce, thanks so much for joining.
Thanks for having me, guys, and glad to see you guys are back up in action.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Well, we appreciate that, Bryce, and we're glad to have you on. You were one of our favorite guests. So, the saying goes, Bryce, that the first casualty of war is the truth. And it's a cliche, but it's true, right? And certainly that's the case with the current war on Gaza being carried out by Israel and its supporters in Washington. And before you got on, I was kind of giving a kind of brief overview of things that have developed up until this point, pointing out that there's a demonstration, there's a global day of action tomorrow in support of Rafah. And a big part of that in this case has been the very black and white, sort of purposefully obscuring way that this has been written about in the corporate press in the US, because the corporate press in the US is a pro-Zionist press. It is an imperialist press, but even right down to the events on October 7th, I think have been horribly, frankly, lied about. I almost said misconstrued, but I mean, they have just been lies. And you published a piece about this on FAIR entitled "Shielding U.S. Public from Israeli Reports of Friendly Fire on October 7th." And so this issue of Israel firing on Israeli soldiers, firing on IDF soldiers, and in some cases killing them, has been completely erased from the narrative, even though, interestingly, as you point out, it has gotten attention in Israeli media, and there have even been investigations. So I don't want to say too much, Bryce, but I was hoping you could break down, number one, what is the truth that we know about how some of this played out on October 7th, and how have we seen the mainstream corporate press frame that?
All right. Well, on October 7th, on the subsequent days, the American public and the global public in general was pretty much subjected to an intense propaganda campaign designed to do a number of things. One of them was to paint Israel as the victim in an unprovoked attack from terrorists. Another thing was to portray those terrorists as something less than human, doing inhuman acts, equating them with groups like ISIS. And a third thing was to cement that narrative in the public mind so much and so with such intensity that any subsequent facts, no matter what the facts are, would end up having little effect on how people actually viewed the event. And Israelis seem to be pretty successful on that front. The stories that I'm sure we all remember about the 40 beheaded babies, they weren't meant to, they weren't accidents. People didn't accidentally make up the number of children dead when in reality there was only one infant who died that day from Hamas rocket fire. That story was designed to portray Hamas as a bunch of barbarians who do unspeakable atrocities. And this was part and parcel of traditional atrocity propaganda in the Western world. I mean, we saw the same thing in Syria. We saw the same thing in Libya. We saw the same thing in all these different places. And so we've come to learn so much more about the actual events those days on that day, that narrative of just an indiscriminate mass killing, mass rape event doesn't really hold up to scrutiny anymore. One of the initial reports to come out of the Israeli press that upended the narrative, or at least challenged it in some way, was the reports of Yasmin Porat, who was a woman who fled the infamous music festival into a nearby kibbutz, and she was being held hostage by Hamas terrorists who says she says treated her, more or less decently. But her and her compatriots were fired at by Israeli troops, and they ended up killing many of her, all of her compatriots, and also all the Hamas terrorists that were in the house she was in. And so this story was reported on in the Israeli press, like I said, but it didn't get much traction here in the West, here in the U.S. press especially. And that's interesting for a number of reasons. One of them is the American press, unlike the Israeli press, doesn't have overt military censorship. So one would think that more of these stories would be showing up in the U.S. press rather than the opposite. But that's not the case. And they're also interesting because uh, more stories kept coming out that seemed to confirm that there were a high degree of Israeli fire that killed their own people. And each time this was reported in the Israeli press, it was ignored in the Western press. Only a small number of outlets actually reported on what was happening in the Israeli press. Electronic Intifada, Mondo Weiss, and the Gray Zone. They did some very excellent reporting, bringing to light these instances of friendly fire. But it became more and more clear that the instances of friendly fire weren't marginal responses to the Hamas attack. They actually constituted a large number of the casualties on that day. Now, as we know, the number of people who were killed on the Israeli side, the Israelis now put that number at around 1,100 to 1,200. They've been revising it lately. And it seems that around 40% of those were security forces. The rest of those were civilians. Now, it's unclear how many of those civilians were killed by Hamas, and it's unclear exactly how many were killed by Israel. But the recent reporting from uh, the Israeli press shows that, well, that number is certainly not zero, and it might be higher than we've been told in the Western press. One of the most recent stories from the Israeli press that shed a lot of light on the orders that were given to the IDF that day came from Yehodiot Aronot, which is their English language name is Ynet, but they published a story in Hebrew. And this story confirmed that Israeli military forces were given the order to implement something called the Hannibal Directive, or at least a version of it, on that day. Now, the Hannibal Directive is an order essentially designed to prevent the enemy from gaining hostages in order to get leverage over the Israeli forces. Instead of allowing the enemy to take hostages, the Israeli military would just simply eliminate everyone involved, including the hostages. Now, this doctrine had usually only applied to military personnel, but it also, according to the reports, the Israeli reports, a version of it was applied on October 7th against civilians as Hamas was taking hostages. And so, again, this report was only covered in the Electronic Intifada, who did an excellent translation and who did an excellent analysis of what this reporting means and signifies for the broader narratives. But again, they were ignored by the Western press. Now, there have been a few instances in which these sorts of friendly fire incidents were described in the mainstream Western press. There were two instances in the New York Times where these claims were brought up, and it was really glossed over. It's one of those things where they would bury it in the 10th paragraph that the Israelis ordered their own to fire. The Israelis ordered the military to fire on their own. It's a pretty major story, but it wasn't emphasized. These allegations and these stories, they were front and center in the Washington Post recently, or I guess about a month ago, in an article that seemed to demonize anyone who would talk about these events. The article, curiously, was called something about October 7th truthers are now trying to change the narrative. The truther, of course, referencing the 9/11 truthers, which has a negative connotation with the American media. But this piece tried to equate people who question the official narrative of October 7th with Holocaust deniers. It spent several paragraphs interviewing Holocaust denial experts and saying that this sort of thing is normal, and saying that people who question October 7th are just like those Holocaust deniers. because there's just a poison strain of anti-Semitism in all mankind. It was completely illogical. And what they did during that piece was to attack the independent reporting at the Electronic Intifada and the Gray Zone, and lop them in with a bunch of cranks from Reddit and Telegram, and then said that uh, they are the equivalent of Holocaust deniers for daring to report the actual facts that have been reported in Israel. And my article in Fair was mostly focusing on this final article, looking at the evidence that they used to dismiss this reporting. Nowhere in the article did it actually refute on a factual basis anything that was reported by the Electronic Intifada and Gray Zone. In fact, they didn't even link to the article so that the reader could see for themselves what was being criticized. And what this shows is that the Washington Post wasn't really trying to teach readers anything or engage in any good faith debate about what the facts say. They're trying to stigmatize the very act of asking questions, the very act of reading the Israeli press, the very act of saying that the reports that we're seeing in the Israeli press aren't very congruent with the narrative that were presented in the American public. Regularly in the American public, we will say that all the deaths were attributed to Hamas. That Hamas's attack was a terrorist attack designed to kill as many as possible. But if we look at again these reports of friendly fire, and we look at these reports of all of the reports that have come out since October 7th, it seems more in line with a military operation, which is exactly what Hamas has claimed. But if we look at the number of civilians who were killed versus the number of combatants who were killed, Israel's response has killed far more higher ratio of civilians than Hamas's attack did. And so to classify one of these as a terrorist attack and another as a military operation, I think is dishonest.
And Bryce, you point out in your article that the New York Times piece, I think, that you referenced that was published on December 22nd of last year, you noted that readers had to read, and this is, I don't think I've ever seen anything this bad, but I always say to people, you can read mainstream media, but you have to read the entire article to really get to the little bit of nugget of truth that they're burying in there. And they really did bury the nugget of truth. You point out that readers had to read 150 paragraphs into the New York Times piece before they came to the stunning revelation that an Israeli general ordered an assault on a house full of hostages. And he knew it was full of hostages because his order included the phrase, even at the cost of civilian casualties. Attack the house, even at the cost of civilian casualties. Now, really, because the U.S. Did report on it at some point, I guess corporate media can say, well, we didn't actually not tell people, but really they might as well have, because we know how people in this country don't like to read. So, I mean, even if they do finally report on what Israel has actually been reporting on in Israel about what they've been doing, I mean, even if U.S. media outlets report it, as long as they bury it deep enough in the article, we'll still never know what really happened, will we? Unless people like us talk about it, of course.
No, you're exactly right. I mean, the drumbeat is really sets the tone for how people view the event, how people are able to interpret the facts. Any outlier reports, I mean, that's not going to compete with the sheer volume of people on television, the volume of people, government officials, all the accounts that you see on social media just parroting the familiar line. And so, even if the New York Times is actually might be illuminating the close reader, they're not illuminating the general public. They know how headlines work. They know how information is processed by the news audience. There's been volumes of research on this, and that certainly informs how the New York Times operates. They know that, and they know good and well that it's explosive, that a general ordered something that would result in civilian casualties, knowing that it would result in civilian casualties. They know that, and they decided not to center it. The term is burying the lead, and that's kind of used as a joke in journalism school, but the New York Times did exactly that. And that's just part and parcel of how our press works, even without censorship. In a country with direct military censorship, they're actually able to confront these issues. They're actually able to write op-eds about how these sorts of incidents should be investigated and how it might upend our understanding of October 7th. They're able to write that in the papers. But our system of censorship is much more tightly controlled than Israelis' military censorship. And that's because the censorship is less formal. It relies on the New York Times editors and the staff and some of the journalists to view themselves as being on the same team. And when you view yourself as on the same team, you don't need to be told what to do to advance the interests of that team. You simply do it. And I know we're going to talk about this soon, but the a recent report from The Intercept shows that the New York Times is willing to go above and beyond even what I thought a dishonest journalistic outlet would do in America.
Yeah, and I was hoping you could get into just that, Bryce, and sort of dig into what the Intercept was reporting on here.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So I think this was 2 or 3 days ago. The Intercept came out with the latest in a series of reports talking about how the New York Times massive article on Hamas systematic rape was full of factual errors and inaccuracies. Prior to this, the Intercept reported that the New York Times tried to adapt that story that made extreme allegations against Hamas and that was used to justify some of Israel's current actions, Israel's genocide in Gaza. The New York Times tried to adapt that story into a podcast for their show, The Daily. But the producers at The Daily actually were, doing their jobs, and they tried to fact check the article. And to say the least, they found it wanting. And so reporters from there, they talked to The Intercept, and The Intercept reported this. And The Intercept came out with a follow-up story that's largely based on one of the co-authors of that original piece, talking about their experience searching for evidence, searching for pieces of pictures, interviews, testimony to back up the extreme claims. And most of the story is about her not finding anything. It's about her calling to these hospitals and not finding anyone who can corroborate these claims that she's making. And so the New York Times, knowing this, they still had her file the story, attached her to a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, and then hired her nephew to help report on this story, who also got a byline in the Times, all without having any journalistic experience whatsoever. So they took this woman and they promoted her claims, her unverified and unsubstantiated claims, and they slapped the New York Times logo on it and then printed the story. And then when people found out quickly that the evidence, even as it was written in the story, didn't point to what the headline was saying, but the story was also based on multiple factual inaccuracies, as that came to light, the New York Times doubled down. And they said that they stand by this reporting. And in fact, they instigated an investigation into who might have been leaking things to The Intercept. And so this is just, ultimate journalistic dishonesty. Some of your listeners may be old enough to know to remember the WMD fiasco that led to the Iraq War. Well, this, in my view, seems to be worse than that. Not only are they lying to justify a war, but they're standing by their lies and they're promoting these people all around in different events. And there seems to be very little accountability. Now, the New York Times, a year after the WND piece, they, apologized, gave a mea culpa. But, by then Iraq was invaded and thousands of lives had been destroyed. And so if the New York Times issues a recall here, I mean, it won't matter. The genocide is ongoing and it will happen. They played their part and now they have to live with it.
Yeah, but the thing is, yes, the genocide is ongoing, but the damage, the fallout, the collateral damage that I'm sure people will call it, of people losing their jobs, students being blackballed by their own universities, university professors being, losing their jobs, teachers and students in high schools, middle schools being silenced from saying anything supportive of Palestine, and most of that seems to have sprung out of a lot of this story, because a lot of the hysteria from the very beginning came from these claims that Hamas was running around beheading babies and committing mass rapes of women and all of this kind of stuff. And I mean, people lost their jobs for not wanting to go along with those lies, because we knew they were lies from the very beginning. So I mean, that is also still going on, right, Bryce? People are still suffering from the fallout of this journalistic malfeasance. Honestly, this crime against journalism that the New York Times has perpetuated, once again, flat out lied. So what does that mean for all of the other people who were caught up in this net of censorship and denying First Amendment rights, and being arrested at protests that we're supposed to be constitutionally protected to participate in, and all of that kind of stuff? Now that we know who's responsible for this, or at least one of the people who are responsible for trafficking and perpetrating these lies, I mean, what do we do with that? I would like to do something with that. But I mean, considering how frequently the New York Times does this, and they're never punished for it, I mean, is this pretty much just going to be more par for the course, or do we really have some kind of meat here as the collateral damage from these escapades that the U.S. government always enters into, but nobody can ever get any redress from?
Well, I think you're right to focus on how this is part and parcel of how the New York Times operates, but it's also considered to be the new normal. And I'm also an organizer in addition to the writing work I do. And one thing I tell my fellow organizers, that every injustice, every ridiculous, ridiculous arrest, ridiculous suspension, ridiculous journalistic malpractice, every time that happens, that's an opportunity to bring more people to your side, to educate more people about how the world actually works, about who has the power, about how truth is manufactured and how consent is engineered. It's a time to educate people about that, because you can tell somebody about how the media lies. You can tell somebody about how uh, you should question the dominant narratives of the state and of corporate power. You can tell somebody that, but until they experience it firsthand, that message isn't going to stick as well. I mean, everyone who is a radical or who has a critique of empire can trace their journey back to an event. For some people, it was Vietnam. For some people, it was the terrorist wars in the 80s. For some people, it was Afghanistan and Iraq. For some people, it was Libya and Syria. Well, for some people, it's going to be Palestine. And that's going to, you have the opportunity here to educate as many people as possible about how this manipulation is carried out in practice. Because people see it on their screens, people see it every day when they talk about it with friends. Uh, but it's up to us. It's up to the people with the critique of empire to actually provide a framework to understand what's happening. It's not gonna. You're not going to change the New York Times disposition. I don't think. I don't think any amount of letters is going to keep the New York Times from promoting the next war with whatever lies that they think up to justify it. The goal is to, again, build a power base that's able to interface with independent media, that's able to read corporate media with a little bit of skepticism and a critical eye, and that's able to translate that into a usable, workable action. And I've been trying to impart that on some of the organizers I'm with. We're fighting the same things that you're talking about. I'm at Indiana University Bloomington, where, and you can read an article I wrote about this at Electronic Intifada, where the university has suspended one of our faculty advisors for the Palestine Solidarity Committee because he filled out a room form wrong, allegedly. But the room was for an event where we hosted Miko Peled. He's an Israeli anti-apartheid activist. We hosted him, but some people didn't like that speaker, and it appears that the university caved to political pressure and instigated an investigation into him that resulted in his suspension. All for the reason that he may have misfilled out a form and that he's a bad influence on his students because they held the event even though the room request was denied a day before. I mean, this is just one of the many things that it's really a microcosm of what's going on around the country. We saw what happened at Harvard. We see what's happening at Columbia, where an IDF student can get away with using chemical weapons on another student, and the university barely raises a hand. We fight for all these things, and each of these injustices, like I said, is an opportunity to educate as many people as possible, because only that education is going to allow the necessary organization that it's required to actually fight back against these systems of injustice, to fight back against Israeli apartheid, against the lobby that manifests itself on college campuses, in Congress, in state houses, and in just regular civil life, to fight against the corporatocracy that's undergirding all of this. Each of these injustices should be taken as a chance to empower.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing all of that, Bryce. And for people who are interested, that piece you wrote on electronic intifada is called "Colleges Serve Genocide by Punishing Campaigners for Palestine." And see, what you just said is the reason why I think we need more journalists as organizers. And you raised a very a good tip for people who are organizing, and that's this thing of highlighting the contradictions. And when you're in the course of struggle, people can see very clearly about what they've been told and what they've been taught contradicts reality. And the whole media literacy thing, I think, is an aspect of that as well. And you use that educational moment to not only help break the, nearly impenetrable wall of propaganda in the United States, while also building the movement. And on a similar note, Bryce, I want to know what you think about how the issue of Palestine and Washington's ongoing open support for Israel's genocide on Palestine and in Gaza. I mean, we've seen Joe Biden give like some, cursory, not even criticisms really about Netanyahu, but like I was mentioning this earlier in the show before you came on, I think he's just trying to, salvage some aspect of perhaps the Arab electorate or the Muslim electorate or the youth voters and things like that. I think in some cases that ship has sailed. But what I'm asking is, how do you think Palestine is reflecting on the internal politics of the United States, especially in 2024, which is an election year?
Well, this is an election year, and it's one that they tell us is one of the most important elections of our lifetime, of course. But they don't seem to care whether or not they win or lose. The Democrats, that is. If you look at polls and you look at public support for the genocide, it's very low. Most people in America are in favor of a ceasefire. The Biden administration sees those polls. They understand that. But they're doubling down. They're saying, we don't care about what you think. We want to support Israel. And every day in the State Department briefings and the Pentagon briefings, they're essentially laughing at the general public, at the journalists who ask serious questions. Questions like, do you believe that Israel is following international law? And then they're met with a smirk, like, that's not for us to determine, or something insane like that. And they say it every day. They're expressing their disdain for the people who elected them. They're expressing their low opinion of everyone in the world because they don't care about whether they win or lose. They see the polls where Biden is unpopular. They see him being incoherent, trying to string a few sentences together. They see all that stuff and they're not doing anything about it. If they wanted to win, they'd offer an alternative vision to what everyone is clamoring against, but they're not doing that. And the reason that uh, this highlights that is because uh, they there's no reason for them to change. The Democratic Party does not gain anything from being in power because they don't have a vision that they want to enact. They don't have a critique of America that if they were just in power, then they could fix X, Y, and Z. They don't have any of that. They have, marginal issues that they campaign on. But, if they lose, that just means they get to campaign on them harder. It doesn't actually affect their political project, which is simply existing as part of this neoliberal corporate duopoly. And I think that this situation in Palestine really highlights that. You saw voters in Michigan in large numbers reject the idea that they were forced to be wedded to the Biden administration. They rejected it. And the Biden administration's response was that, well, they'll probably fall in line later. It's just disgusting. And I don't think that there is a path for this current Democratic Party leadership to getting back the young people's vote in 2024 or really ever, because they're, again, people used to have a short memory in politics. That seems to be the conventional wisdom. If you trample on a population for generations and generations, eventually there's going to be a generation of people who are simply unmoved by the old propaganda tropes, unmoved by the beating of the drum, waving of the flags, all that nonsense that used to work in the past. There seems to be a generational shift in which, especially the young people, are no longer taking this. So, what does that mean for the republic? What does that mean for democracy in the world? What does that mean for the world order as it stands? Well, it seems that given that Democrats aren't willing to fight for anything and they don't seem to care whether or not they win or lose, they're giving all the ground to the Republican. And they're giving our country over to, people who it's easy to say that they're fascist and they have fascist plans for this country. The Democrats are a different sign of fascism, but their ineffectiveness makes them essentially collaborators in that greater fascism. And I think that what that means for us is that not only are we going to have to, again, use the moment, which will no doubt be an unprecedented assault on civil liberties and everything we hold dear, we have to use that, again, to highlight the contradictions, to build alternative structures of power, to educate people about what their options are and what their options are not limited to. People don't see the idea that you can take an alternative power structure and use that to influence your government. People don't see that because that's not taught to them. But again, it's up to organizers to use those experiences of struggle to educate people about those ideas. And I think that that's the only practical thing that we can do at this point.
Yeah, Bryce, and you mentioned the youth, that the Democratic Party seems to be pretty comfortable with losing. I guess I suppose they were pretty comfortable with losing the youth vote when that student loan debt forgiveness didn't really happen, or it sort of happened and it was reversed, and now it's kind of sort of happening again in dribs and drabs, but it's not universal. And it's weird because people live in a country where they remember all of those COVID loans that business owners took out, and the government forgave all of that debt. Not a problem. But student loan debt, that's just too hard. So, I mean, there have been serious issues with the Biden administration before his obvious support and enabling of genocide in Palestine. But I mean, what argument could the Democrats have in the face of all of these people, millions of people at this point, who understand a lot more now, I think, at least what this government is all about when it comes to warfare and genocide? I mean, the Democratic Party is not going to get these young voters back, but neither are they're not going Republican either. So I wonder, Bryce, if you think that this moment in time actually provides kind of a decent springboard for a third party to emerge in the electoral field, because I don't see being able to convince people that you should be looking at a third party outside of the obvious horrible reality that people didn't want to uh, um, take into consideration about Biden, that they always believed about the Republicans, right? But now they see, no, the Democrats love genocide just as much. Is this the moment for a third party too?
Well, yeah, I would like to believe that a third party might help solve this problem. And in theory, I think a third party would go a long way in alleviating some of the pressure valves. But there's a third party that looks like I wanted to, and there's a third party that seems to be most likely. And it doesn't seem like there's any force around the country that's sufficiently organized to mount a serious grassroots third party challenge. We had a chance with Cornel West, but that campaign, it stalled out. And the only other person who seems to be mounting a serious or a halfway serious challenge to the existing party structure is Robert Kennedy Jr. And Kennedy Jr., he's gone out of his way to not only align himself with Israel's genocide, but to outdo both Biden and any other high-level political official on the subject. And so the idea that he's would be an independent voice against the power structures that we have now, that seems like a dubious prospect to me. And so what does that leave? It leaves a scattering of candidates like who are polling at like 10%, Jill Stein, and I think those Party of Social Liberation women are running as well. But none of those seem to me like anything like a party structure that could rival the Democratic or Republican Party structure. And so I think anyone listening to this and saying, "Oh wow, I wish there was a third party," I think that your time is 2028. I think that now, if you really wanted to have a third party, you need to start working at the local level. Our elections are largely geographic based, and if we can build a local alternative, that can be a framework that we could use to export to different areas in the country. Because you're not going to you're not going to elect a president if a bunch of people in scattered geographic areas that are all minorities in their own states decide that they want a third party president. No, it has to be all of these states having a geographic consensus. And that's easier said than done, but if it is going to happen, it would have to start at the local level first. And so my advice to any organizers who are thinking about this, I mean, look at your local issues. Look at what unites people. Work on that, build coalitions, solve problems, and then see if you can solidify the structure that was able to achieve those things. And see if you can connect that structure with some other people in your state who are trying to do something similar. And then see if you can run a local candidate. See if you can run a county candidate. See if you can run a statewide candidate. If you can do those things, then you're proving yourself to be an efficient machine that's capable of challenging the existing structures. But if we don't have anything that can do that, and I don't see that manifesting itself by November, well, then I think that our focus should turn away from presidential politics into the things that we can affect, into the local organizing that we can do, so we can build that structure and build those muscles for a future independent and grassroots organizing push.
Yeah, I agree that there tend to be more opportunities for alternative parties in certain local elections. And I think that also means that, as a social movement, when we talk about the progressive forces in the United States, people who want to see a dispensation, that has an element of social uplift, just to use a very, very broad term, because that can, shake out a number of different ways. I think the movement has to look at electoralism on the national level a little differently. I think we have to see the presidential election as a movement building exercise. And in the same way, that we were talking about earlier of highlighting contradictions. You mentioned Jill Stein of the Green Party. You mentioned Claudia de la Cruz and Karina Garcia, the Party for Socialism and Liberation. I mean, we're talking about movement people, people who have a history of, you know, being in the streets and being a part of social movements. And so I think a part of this opportunity is understanding that people, I think, like in a subconscious way, more and more are seeing they're seeing the fact that the U.S. electoral system, as it stands, doesn't hold a lot of solutions for them. And not only that, the whole duopoly, the ruling class duopoly of Democrats and Republicans, is maintained very intentionally and is very seriously guarded. I mean, every institutional roadblock has been put in place to ensure that no one, except someone who's part of one of the two ruling parties, can actually enter, to be considered a serious contender for president, or even have access to the debate stage. I mean, even something as basic as ballot access. That's always like a big question with alternative parties, right? Why? Because, well, first of all, in the United States, there's 50 states, so there's basically 50 different elections. I don't even think a lot of Americans think of it that way, but
Right.
but that's true. And secondly, if you're going to have ballot access in all 50 states, then you have to have an incredible amount of manpower and money and resources to be able to do that. I mention all the time that every presidential election cycle breaks the record for spending. There's more and more money being spent on presidential campaigns, but we don't see that trickle down to these things that people need. Not only do we not see those resources going to things that people need, people are made to feel that they are in the wrong for even talking about the things that they need or what they expect a president to do for them, whether it's Joe Biden, Hillary Clinton, or whoever. You know what I mean? And so social movements understanding that, I think, should sort of seize upon that kind of nascent consciousness and engage in that kind of political education that we were talking about before. And it's like, yeah, this system, this electoral system that we told is the greatest to ever exist, is rife with all of these contradictions. And so if you want to vote for something you want, then you have this option, but it's deeper than the vote you cast in November. It's more about how do we build this collective force that you were describing earlier, Bryce, to really carry all of this through. Because it's clear that there's no solution for us within this system.
Right.
Therefore, you know, and as a socialist, it's my opinion that we have to organize to fight and build an entirely new system. So I think that that's a part of the value of electoralism at this level for different people. And of course, you know, there are differing opinions. Some people feel like it's a waste of time or that organizations' resources could be better spent doing other things. I tend to believe that anything that is really speaking to the needs of our class and putting us in closer contact with our class is a valuable use of our time. You know what I mean? And also, this is also why joining organizations is so important. And this is something that we try to stress as a movement, is joining organizations, so that there can be, you know, different groups doing different things, and even people within organizations that may be focused on different aspects while others are doing it. It's all a question of how are we organized? That people talk about a lot of things in this political moment, but I think the most pertinent question is, how are we organized and what can we do to develop and build this movement, which will be the only thing that we can sort of build as a real threat to this system that seems invincible. And this is why I'm so glad that, we have, folks like Bryce, who are both great journalist, and also get directly involved in political organizing. I think far too often journalists are standing sort of outside of movements and kind of commentating without being involved. And this is also why we have to continue to be steadfast in our organizing and to be clear and unafraid in our analysis about what must be done, both to free Palestine and to end imperialism once and for all. But we want to thank Bryce Green so much for joining us today. This has been Darker Than Blue on WPFW, Washington, D.C., and we will see you next time. Peace.
Peace, y'all. All righty, let's stop sharing that screen. Okay, I have to run. Not doing the extended show tonight because, there's always organizing stuff to do. I'm on my way to speak at the 70th anniversary commemoration of the Great Puerto Rican resistance action that was held in Congress 70 years ago. And you're just going to have to look it up. But they asked me to come out and speak, and I certainly will. So I'm going to head over to the U.S. Capitol. But Tuesday, let me get my WhatsApp out so I can tell you what's going on later on this week's Tuesday. Let's see, can I get this? Because sometimes they share and sometimes they won't. Yeah, there we go. All right. Palestine and Africa, the historical relationship. This is an event that we are co-sponsoring here at Montgomery College at the Tacoma Park campus in room CM711. And this will be on March 7th from 1 to 3 p.m. It's free. It's on Montgomery College campus. Just go and hang out and hear about the historical relationship between Palestine and Africa and the present day struggle of Africans and Palestinians. So the Black Alliance for Peace has that scheduled for May 7th at Montgomery College. Excuse me. As far as I know, it will not be Zoom. I'm sorry. No, yes, it will. Sorry. Right there. Zoom link right there. Let me see if I can copy it to get it to you. Nope, it won't do it that way for me. Let's see. I'll put it in the chat this way. I love it when technology doesn't exactly do everything you want it to do. But Montgomery College Zoom US, my USTAV. Oh no, that's not right. VUSG, and then there's a question mark, and then there's an OMN, and this is so annoying, but 973-616-217. I think that's it. All right. Okay, that should be the Zoom link. If you have a problem with the Zoom link, let me know. Because I typed it and who knows what'll happen. So that's what we have going on March 7th. Let's see. We kicked off another Day of Action for Haiti campaign. The BAP Africa team, the Haiti and the Americas team kicked off another campaign to support Haiti as they are looking to see whether they can stop this continued attempt to invade Haiti. So we had a couple of people in different chapters around the country do different things to kick off this campaign. We had a banner drop here. Had a couple of comrades in another place just get together and do Hands Off Haiti. We are... Oh, hope you can hear that.
The nation remains trapped in neocolonial dominance and threatened by imperialist agendas, primarily from the United States. The assassination of President Jovenel Moise in 2021 further exacerbated the crisis, leaving the country without elected leadership. Unelected Prime Minister Ariel Henry, perceived as a puppet for foreign interests, particularly the US, UN, and core group, obstructs Haitian sovereignty and suppresses popular dissent through paramilitary groups and police violence.
Avoiding the ensuing chaos, de facto Prime Minister Ariel Henry seeks to deepen foreign military intervention under the guise of pan-Africanism, as evidenced by William Russo's offer of troop deployment with U.S. support, which results in an occupied nation stripped of self-determination with external actors seizing authority. The pretext for this occupation is the escalation of gang violence, which is used to justify maintaining control over Haiti. However, organizations like MONAP argue that this violence serves the imperialist agenda of the U.S. and core group, aiming to crush popular resistance and perpetuate political manipulation.
This alliance between the armed groups, politicians, and the bourgeoisie collaborate to suppress any form of dissent, while Honoré receives support for fraudulent elections. As Haitians mobilize to demand Honoré's resignation, the crackdown intensifies, exacerbating the already dire situation. Trade is paralyzed, basic necessities are scarce, and the population suffers from the violence perpetuated by quasi-paramilitary forces. This systematic assault on collective well-being illustrates how imperialism utilizes gang warfare to maintain control and undermine Haitian autonomy.
So there you go. That's one. This is another piece of art that was given to us, created for the campaign by BAP SoCal member T. This is really great. And so next week, that's our comrades at the Cuban Embassy, Monday night. Let's see. So that's the kind of stuff we are doing, and you will hear more. That's enough. You will hear more about the Hands Off Haiti actions this month. There is more to come, and I saw someone say that there's a problem with the link. Let's see. Let me see. And I know you cannot, it won't do the image. So let me all right. And you probably really can't see that. Oh, let's see. Oh, was it the HTTPS part? Okay, let's Montgomery College, Zoom, US, my, USTAVUSG, freaky question mark, OMN equal 73616600217. All right. Let me test it, make sure it does work. Oh, really? Is that what you did? Huh. Oh, that's why. That's why I put the wrong thing there. Instead of an equal sign, all right, I am going to have to get this Montgomery College, Zoom US, my USTAVUSG question, OMN equals 97361660217. Yeah, I am not sure what the problem is here. So I'm going to have to get the correct Zoom link for you and drop it in on you next week. I don't know. When is March 7th? Lord, I'm all over the place. It's nuts. This week has been really quite crazy. Okay, cool. So I'll get the correct link to you on the 5th on the Remix Morning Show. Sorry that this is not translating to what it is. And I'm thinking that when they rescheduled it, because they had to reschedule this from a previous event, and they had to reschedule it because there were some members of the board that approves these things didn't want to have Rafiki as a guest because of his anti-Semitic remarks in the previous. Yeah, whatever, man. That's not, we don't play that game. So March 7th is the event. March 5th, I will have the correct link for you. Sorry about that. Hopefully have some footage, I don't know, from the event tonight, which I have to scoot over to right now. There's another big Palestinian march, global Palestinian march tomorrow. We'll probably be there, but we won't be participating. I've got a bunch of writing to do, so I may not be there because this is the first weekend where I actually have some assignments to do that I may get paid for. So that's pretty dope. So thank you so much for joining Darker Than Blue tonight. We appreciate you. Join us again next Friday for another episode of Darker Than Blue and for a follow-up at 6 p.m. right after Ward. Don't know what it is yet, but I know I'm going to do something. So y'all have a good weekend. Be really good. Take good care of each other. And as always, a luta continua. The struggle continues, but if we keep fighting, I promise, Victoria Acerta. Victory is certain. Peace, y'all.